Before Alabama had a flag, before its borders were settled, there were whispers moving quietly through its plantations. Whispers about children who did not look like they were supposed to. On slave quarters where generations had been born into bondage, girls began arriving with skin too pale for the world they were forced into, hair touched with red or copper instead of black, and eyes that raised uncomfortable questions no one dared to ask aloud. These children were not mistakes of nature. They were living evidence of a secret Alabama was desperate to keep buried. Plantation records noted them as mulatto, or simply ignored their appearance altogether. But everyone saw the truth. These girls carried the physical marks of white ancestry in a society built on the lie of racial purity. Their mothers were enslaved women with no legal voice, no protection, and no right to name the men who visited them after dark. Their fathers walked freely in daylight, sometimes masters, sometimes overseers, sometimes guests, men whose names were respected, recorded, and remembered, while the girls they created were treated as property. As these red-haired, pale-skinned children grew, Alabama faced a contradiction it could not resolve. The law said one drop of African blood meant slavery, yet their faces reflected the very men who owned them. Some were hidden indoors, others sold far away before questions could grow too loud, and a few were raised close to the big house, close enough to serve, never close enough to belong. No documents named their fathers, no family trees claimed them. History looked away. This is the story Alabama never taught. The story of slave girls whose bodies exposed a system built on violence, silence, and denial. Girls born into chains, marked by bloodlines no one would acknowledge, carrying secrets that plantations worked tirelessly to erase. In the slave quarters of Alabama, births were usually predictable in the eyes of the system that controlled them. Children arrived marked by the same features their mothers carried: skin darkened by ancestry, hair tightly curled, bodies immediately classified as property. The moment they took their first breath, plantation life depended on this predictability. It made ownership simple, laws easy to apply, and violence easier to justify. But every so often that expectation shattered. A child would be born whose appearance disrupted everything the plantation believed it understood about race, power, and control. These births did not happen in the big house with doctors and records. They happened in cramped cabins, on dirt floors with other enslaved women standing watch. When a girl emerged with skin noticeably lighter than her mother's, when her hair showed shades of copper, auburn, or red under the weak candlelight, the room would fall silent. This was not subtle difference. Red hair was rare even among white families in the region, and pale skin stood out sharply against the reality of slave life. These were not traits that could be explained away easily, and everyone present understood what such features implied. At first, midwives and older women would search for reassurance in memory, wondering if some distant ancestor might explain the child's appearance. But these communities knew their histories intimately. They knew who came from where, who had been sold, who had survived the crossing, who had been born on the land. Red hair did not appear out of nowhere. Pale skin did not come without cause. The explanation lay not in ancestry generations removed, but in events much closer, much darker, and much more dangerous to acknowledge. Word spread quietly through the quarters. No one spoke loudly about such children, because speaking too loudly could bring punishment. But silence could not erase what eyes could plainly see. As days passed and the baby did not darken, as the hair grew brighter rather than fading, the whispers hardened into certainty. This child carried the blood of a white man. On plantations where white men controlled every aspect of enslaved women's lives, that fact was not shocking, but seeing the evidence so clearly unsettled even those accustomed to brutality. For the enslaved mother, the birth was terrifying. A child who looked different attracted attention, and attention was dangerous. She could not claim the father, could not accuse, could not protect herself with truth. If asked, she might say nothing at all, or she might insist she did not know. Sometimes she truly did not know which man had done this to her, because choice was never part of the encounter. The system did not care how conception happened. It cared only that the child belonged to the enslaved class, regardless of appearance. Plantation owners reacted with a mix of denial and calculation. A red-haired, pale-skinned slave girl was an inconvenience, a visible contradiction to the mythology that whiteness was pure and separate. Some masters insisted the child be labeled mulatto in records, a vague term meant to blur reality. Others avoided recording the birth altogether. There were cases where infants were quickly sold to distant plantations before neighbors could ask questions, before the child's face became familiar enough to stir rumor. In some instances these girls were kept close, not out of kindness but out of control. A pale-skinned child working inside the house could be explained away more easily than one laboring in the fields under the sun. Sunlight darkened skin and clothing hid hair. Indoors appearances could be managed. Outdoors they could. The decision of where such a child lived and worked was often strategic, shaped by fear of scandal rather than concern for the child's well-being. The presence of these children forced plantations to confront what they pretended did not exist. Every red-haired slave girl was proof that the boundary between master and enslaved was crossed regularly, violently and without consequence for one side. Alabama law insisted that status followed the mother, ensuring that no matter how white a child appeared, she remained enslaved. This legal rule was not accidental. It was designed to protect white men from responsibility, to turn evidence of abuse into economic gain. As these girls grew, their difference became harder to conceal. Childhood curiosity turned into adult suspicion. Visitors noted. Other white families noticed. Questions hovered unspoken in the air. Who was her father? Why does she look like that? Why does she resemble someone who lives in the big house? The answers were never given, but the discomfort they caused reshaped how these girls were treated, watched and controlled. For the enslaved community, these births were reminders of vulnerability. They knew that what happened to one woman could happen to any of them. A red-haired baby was not just a curiosity, it was a warning. It showed how completely their bodies were accessible to men who would never claim the consequences. It showed how the system could force a woman to carry a child that made her life more dangerous rather than more secure. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain plantations seemed to have more of these children than others. Certain families seemed always to have a pale-skinned girl somewhere in their records, always unnamed, always unclaimed. Alabama did not investigate these patterns. Churches did not record sermons about them. Schools would later erase them entirely, but in the quarters memory was sharp, and stories were passed down in fragments, careful not to name names, careful not to provoke punishment. These unusual births disrupted the lie that slavery was orderly and moral. They exposed it as chaotic, exploitative and deeply personal in its violence. Each pale-skinned, red-haired girl embodied a secret that could not be undone once she existed. No law, no ledger, no silence could fully erase what her body revealed. She carried the evidence of a crime that had no courtroom, no trial and no justice, living proof of a system that created its own contradictions and then demanded that everyone pretend not to see them. On Alabama plantations, information rarely moved in straight lines. It traveled in glances, pauses, half-finished sentences, and looks held a second too long. Whispers were safer than statements, and suspicion survived best when it was never fully spoken. When a child was born who unsettled expectations, the reaction did not arrive as outrage or inquiry but as a quiet shift in behavior. People noticed. They always noticed. But they learned early that noticing too openly invited punishment. The whispers began among the enslaved first, because they lived closest to one another's lives. They saw which women were summoned at night, which returned shaken and silent, which began to show signs of pregnancy without explanation. They knew which overseers lingered too long near certain cabins, which masters drank heavily before walking away from the big house after dark. None of this required confirmation. It existed as a shared understanding, built from repetition and fear. When a pale-skinned or red-haired girl appeared, those unspoken observations suddenly had a face. The whispering never asked directly who the father was. That question was too dangerous, too explicit. Instead, it circled around safer phrases. People would say the child was marked or touched. They would remark on how she favored no one in the quarters. They would mention how the timing aligned with certain visits, or certain absences. These were not accusations. They were acknowledgments without name. Everyone listening knew exactly what was being suggested, and everyone understood why it would never be confirmed aloud. White households whispered too, but differently. Their suspicions were shaped by reputation rather than vulnerability. A master's wife might notice a resemblance she could not unsee. A guest might glance between a child serving at the table and the man at the head of it. A neighbor might comment casually on a slave girl's appearance, then watch closely for the reaction. These conversations took place behind closed doors, framed as concern or curiosity, but driven by fear of scandal. No one wanted certainty. Certainty demanded action, and action threatened stability. On a plantation, stability was built on silence. To ask directly who fathered such a child risked exposing truths that could unravel social order. White men's authority depended on the illusion that boundaries were maintained, even when everyone knew they were not. As long as suspicion remained unspoken, the illusion survived. Children born with unusual features became subjects of constant observation. People watched who looked at them too long, who avoided them entirely, who seemed uncomfortable in their presence. Every interaction was weighed for meaning. A master who never acknowledged a child might still arrange her work carefully. An overseer who punished her harshly might be silencing his own fear. A mistress who insisted the girl be kept out of sight might be protecting her household from questions she did not want answered. The enslaved learned to read these signals early. They understood that certain children were dangerous simply by existing. They learned which names not to say, which questions not to ask, which looks to avoid. Mothers taught daughters to lower their eyes, to speak softly, to never draw attention to themselves. A child who looked different did not need to be told she was different. The plantation taught her through avoidance, restriction and constant supervision. Suspicion also traveled through punishment. A girl might be whipped for small mistakes while others were not. She might be moved suddenly to another section of the plantation without explanation. She might be denied contact with her mother more frequently. These actions were never explained, but they communicated clearly. The whispers did not need words when the consequences spoke for them. Among the enslaved, suspicion carried another weight. It reminded them that intimacy was never safe. Relationships between enslaved men and women already existed under constant threat of separation and sale. The presence of children whose fathers were clearly not enslaved men deepened that insecurity. It reinforced the knowledge that white men could intervene in their lives at any moment, without consent, without accountability, and without consequence. The whispers grew louder during gatherings, but only just enough to be shared. Around cooking fires during washing, while tending children, fragments of conversation slipped through. Someone might recall another plantation where the same thing had happened. Someone else might mention a girl who disappeared after people began talking too much. These stories were not meant to solve anything. They were warnings disguised as memory. Suspicion followed these children as they aged. Adolescence sharpened everything. A pale-skinned girl approaching womanhood drew attention that made both white and black communities uneasy. White men's interest was dangerous, and white women's resentment could be deadly. Enslaved men risked punishment simply by being seen near her. The plantation adjusted accordingly, tightening control, limiting movement and reinforcing silence. Even religion did not offer refuge. Churches avoided acknowledging what everyone knew. Sermons spoke of obedience and order, not hypocrisy. Baptism records listed names without detail. The whispers stayed outside official spaces, living in the margins where truth was allowed to exist but never recognized. Over time, suspicion became a kind of inheritance. Children who grew up around these stories absorbed them without being told. They learned which subjects were dangerous, which histories were incomplete, which questions had no answer. A red-haired or pale-skinned girl did not need to ask who her father was to understand that knowing would not change her fate. The absence of answers became its own form of knowledge. Plantations depended on this unspoken agreement. Everyone knew enough to understand the truth, and everyone knew enough to never say it. The whispers sustained the system by allowing it to function without confrontation. Suspicion remained suspended in the air, shaping behavior, enforcing boundaries, and protecting those with power from accountability. In that space between knowing and saying, entire lives were controlled, defined not by what could be proven, but by what everyone already understood. For enslaved women in Alabama, motherhood existed under conditions that stripped it of protection, authority and voice. Pregnancy did not belong to them in the way it did to free women. Their bodies were not considered private, their consent was never required, and their words carried no legal weight. When a child was conceived, especially under circumstances involving white men, the mother's role in the story ended at birth. She could carry the child, labor through delivery, and keep the infant alive, but she had no recognized right to explain how that child came into the world. The law made this silence permanent. Enslaved women were not permitted to testify against white men, which meant that even if a woman wanted to speak the truth, there was no forum where her words mattered. Courts did not hear her. Records did not include her account. Churches did not ask. Her knowledge of who fathered her child existed only within her own memory and among those who shared her daily life. Officially, that knowledge did not exist at all. This legal erasure served a purpose. By denying enslaved women the right to name fathers, the system protected white men from responsibility. A man could assault an enslaved woman, produce a child who looked like him, and face no consequence beyond temporary discomfort. The child would be enslaved by law, increasing the owner's wealth rather than diminishing it. The mother would remain silent, not because she lacked truth, but because truth offered her no safety. For many women, silence was not only enforced by law but by fear. Naming a father could invite brutal retaliation. A woman who spoke too openly risked whipping, sale, separation from her children, or worse, even hinting at a white man's involvement could be interpreted as accusation, insolence or disruption. Survival required restraint. Silence became a form of protection, even when it came at the cost of erasing one's own story. Some women truly could not identify a single father. Enslavement created conditions where repeated violations were common, where men came and went,
where nights blurred together under threat and coercion. In such circumstances, the idea of paternity lost meaning. The system did not care who the father was, only that the child increased the labor force. The mother's uncertainty was treated no differently than certainty would have been. Either way, her voice was irrelevant. When children were born with features that clearly suggested white ancestry, the mother's silence became even more significant. Others might speculate, overseers might know, masters might suspect, but the woman at the center of it all was never asked directly, and if she was, her answer carried no authority. She might say she did not know, she might refuse to answer, she might speak the truth quietly to another enslaved woman, knowing that such words could never leave that This forced silence reshaped motherhood itself. Enslaved women learned to separate their inner truth from outward expression. They could love their children fiercely while knowing they could never fully explain their origin. They learned to protect their daughters not with honesty but with caution. They taught them how to survive attention, how to avoid drawing notice, how to lower their eyes and guard their words. Identity became something internal, never declared. Naming carried power, and enslaved women were denied it. They could not name the men who violated them, and often they could not even choose their children's surnames. Many children were named by owners, listed in inventories alongside livestock, and the absence of a father's name on a record was not an oversight, it was intentional. It preserved a structure where white masculinity remained unquestioned, and enslaved women remained invisible. This invisibility extended into history. Later generations searching records would find mothers listed without context, children listed without lineage, and fathers listed nowhere at all. The silence was built into the archive. What looked like missing information was actually evidence of deliberate erasure. The inability of enslaved women to name fathers ensured that the burden of mystery would fall on the children, not on the men who caused it. Within the quarters, however, truth often existed in fragments. Women shared pieces of their stories with each other, carefully, selective. These exchanges were acts of trust. They allowed women to reclaim some control over their own narratives, even if only in private. But these truths had to remain contained. To let them spread too far risked exposing the woman to danger and the community to punishment. The emotional weight of this silence was immense. A woman could look at her child and see the face of the man who harmed her, yet be unable to speak his name. She could watch that child grow under the authority of the same household that caused her trauma. She could endure questions from others without being allowed to answer them honestly. This was not just silence, it was enforced forgetting. For children, the absence of a named father created a gap that shaped their lives. They sensed the tension, the avoidance, the guarded look. They learned early that certain questions were forbidden. Mothers often redirected curiosity, not out of deception, but out of necessity. To know too much was dangerous, to ask too loudly was worse. The mother's silence became a shield, even as it withheld truth. Enslaved women carried this burden generation after generation. Each unnamed father reinforced the message that their experiences did not matter to the world beyond the plantation. Their bodies could produce labor, but their voices could not produce accountability. The system relied on this imbalance. Without it, slavery could not function as smoothly as it did. The inability to name fathers was not a passive condition. It was actively enforced through law, violence, and custom. It shaped how enslaved women understood themselves, how they related to their children, and how history would later remember them. Their silence was mistaken for absence, but it was always full of knowledge, fear, endurance, and truths that had nowhere safe to be spoken.
On Alabama plantations, the boundary between day and night marked two different worlds. Daytime belonged to order, routine, and performance. White men moved through fields and houses as masters, overseers, employers, churchgoers, and fathers. Their authority was visible, documented, and defended by law. Night, however, belonged to something else entirely. When darkness settled over the land, the rules that were publicly enforced loosened, and the power that had always existed quietly stepped fully into the open. Enslaved women learned early that night carried risk. Footsteps sounded different after sundown. A knock on a cabin door meant something entirely different than one during daylight. Sometimes there was no knock at all, a shadow passing the doorway, a voice calling a name softly, an overseer standing just outside the range of lantern light. These encounters were never framed as choices. Refusal was not an option that existed in practice, no matter how often the system pretended otherwise. White men who came at night did so knowing they would not be questioned in the morning. Their movements were unrecorded, their presence unofficial. What happened after dark left no marks on ledgers, No entries in journals meant for public eye. The same man who visited a cabin after midnight could sit at breakfast hours later, reading scripture or giving instructions, his reputation intact. The separation between night and day protected him completely. For Enslaved women, the transition back to daylight required erasure. Whatever happened after dark had to disappear by morning. Bruises were hidden. Tears were swallowed. Fear was carried silently through the next day's labor. To acknowledge what had occurred would be to accuse someone whose word outweighed hers by law, custom, and violence. Silence was not only expected, it was enforced by the certainty that speaking would make everything worse. These nighttime visits were not isolated incidents. On many plantations they followed patterns. Certain men returned repeatedly. Certain women were targeted over and over. Others lived in constant dread, knowing that attention could shift at any moment. Pregnancy was often the first visible consequence of these visits. But even then the system worked to deny their meaning. A woman's condition was noted, not questioned. The cause was assumed, but never discussed. In daylight, white men maintained distance from the consequences of their actions. They did not acknowledge children born from these encounters. They did not intervene on behalf of the mothers. They did not alter their behavior publicly. Any resemblance between themselves and a child was treated as coincidence or ignored altogether. The power of denial lay not in convincing everyone else, but in ensuring that no one could challenge it. Enslaved communities understood this hypocrisy intimately. They saw which men visited, which cabins. They saw who returned shaken and who avoided eye contact afterward. They saw children born months later with features that mirrored the men who walked freely among them. Yet even within the community these truths were handled carefully. To speak too openly risked attracting attention that could lead to collective punishment. Nighttime violations reshaped daily life in subtle ways. Women adjusted how they slept, how they positioned themselves, how they responded to sounds outside. Some tried to stay near others, some tried to remain awake. None of these strategies offered real protection. Power moved where it wanted. The illusion of control existed only for those who held it. The absence of accountability was central to the system's survival. By keeping these acts confined to the night and unspoken during the day, slavery preserved its public image. Plantations could present themselves as orderly, moral, and disciplined spaces, while violence continued uninterrupted in the shadows. The contradiction was not a flaw. It was a feature. Children born from these encounters became living reminders of what night concealed. Their existence threatened the separation between public respectability and private abuse. This is why their fathers remained silent in daylight. Acknowledgement would collapse the careful division that protected white authority. Silence allowed men to continue moving freely between roles without consequence. White women on plantations were often aware of these nighttime realities, though their awareness existed within its own constraint. Some chose denial. Others responded with resentment directed at enslaved women rather than at the men responsible. Rarely did that resentment turn into protection. The structure of power ensured that blame flowed downward, never up. Morning always arrived regardless of what happened in the dark. Fields needed tending. Meals needed preparing. Children needed caring for. Enslaved women carried the weight of the night into the day, performing normalcy under constant surveillance. The system depended on this performance. It required women to act as though nothing had happened, as though their bodies and lives had not been invaded hours earlier. Over time the rhythm became normalized. Night brought fear and violation. Day brought denial and routine. White men learned they could cross boundaries without cost, as long as they returned to their roles by sunrise. The plantation absorbed these acts without disruption, converting trauma into silence and silence into stability. The legacy of these nighttime visits did not end with the men who made them. It lived on in the children who carried unacknowledged bloodlines, in the mothers who carried unspoken memories, and in a historical record that pretended these encounters were rare, or non-existent. The day told one story, the night told another, and only one of them was ever allowed to be written down on Alabama plantations. Language was not neutral. Words were chosen carefully, not to describe reality but to manage. When children were born whose appearance disrupted the rigid racial order, pale skin, straight or red hair, light eyes, the system reached for a term that could absorb contradiction without resolving it. Mulatto became that word. It sounded official, scientific and distant, and that distance mattered. It allowed those in power to acknowledge difference without confronting its cause. The label appeared in ledgers, inventories, church records, and bills of sale, next to a child's name, sometimes even replacing it. The word functioned as a classification rather than an explanation. It did not say who the father was.
It did not say how the child came to look the way she did. It simply marked her as something between categories, something that could be owned without further inquiry. The label did not clarify the truth. It buried it under paperwork. Plantation owners relied on this ambiguity. A red-haired girl listed as mulatto no longer required uncomfortable questions. The term suggested mixed ancestry without demanding specificity. It implied distance, as though the whiteness in her features came from some vague, untraceable past, rather than from a man who might still be alive, present and powerful. By using the label, owners protected themselves and others like them from scrutiny. The word also carried legal weight. Laws governing slavery depended on clear categories, but they also allowed for flexibility when it benefited white interests. Mulatto functioned as a legal buffer. No matter how white a child appeared, the label anchored her firmly within the enslaved class. It reinforced the principle that status followed the mother, not the father, and that appearance could not override property law. The term helped ensure that no visual contradiction could threaten ownership. For enslaved communities, the label rang hollow. They knew what it concealed. They had seen the visits, the patterns, the timing. Calling a child mulatto did not erase memory or observation. It merely signaled that the truth was not safe to speak. The word became a reminder of how reality could be officially rewritten while remaining privately understood. In practice, the label flattened individual stories. It treated vastly different experiences as identical. A child born from a single assault, one born from repeated abuse, one born from coercion disguised as favoritism. All were reduced to the same term. The emotional, physical and psychological realities of their mothers vanished behind a single word. The label did not reflect lived experience. It replaced it. The use of mulatto also shifted attention away from white men entirely. It framed difference as a trait of the child rather than evidence of adult behavior. The focus rested on what the child was, not on what had been done to create her. This linguistic shift was powerful. It transformed acts of violence into abstract categories, allowing society to discuss race without discussing responsibility. In some cases, the label was applied even when it made no sense visually. Children who looked fully white were still classified as mulatto if their mothers were enslaved. The term became a tool to override sight itself. No matter what the eye perceived, the word dictated reality. This inversion of truth demonstrated the extent to which language served power, rather than accuracy. The label followed children throughout their lives. It appeared on sale documents, work assignments and punishment records. It shaped how they were treated by overseers and other enslaved people. A girl labeled mulatto might be assigned different labor, watched more closely, or subjected to different expectations. The word carried implications about obedience, value and vulnerability, none of which were chosen by the child herself. White society used the term to maintain distance. Calling a child mulatto reassured white communities that boundaries still existed, even when evidence suggested otherwise. It allowed people to acknowledge mixed appearance without acknowledging intimacy. The word acted as a shield against moral reckoning, preserving the illusion that racial lines, though blurred, were still controlled. Over time, the repetition of the label normalized erasure. Generations grew up seeing the term in records without context. Historians later encountered it stripped of explanation, mistaking classification for truth. The label outlived the people who applied it, carrying their denial forward into the future. What looked like documentation was actually a record of avoidance. For the children themselves, the label imposed an identity that answered nothing. It did not tell them who they were or where they came from. It only told them what they were not allowed to be. They were not white, no matter how they looked. They were not entitled to lineage, no matter how obvious it seemed. The label closed doors without opening any. Mothers understood the word's function immediately. Hearing their child reduced to a category confirmed what they already knew, that the system would never recognize their truth. The label warned them not to expect justice, acknowledgement or protection. It signaled that the child's existence would be managed, not understood. The term also allowed communities to talk around the truth rather than through it. People could say mulatto child instead of saying the master's daughter. They could discuss labor, value and discipline without naming the relationships that made such discussions necessary. Language created distance where proximity was undeniable. In this way, mulatto was not merely descriptive. It was strategic. It was chosen precisely because it obscured more than it revealed. It absorbed contradiction, redirected blame and preserved hierarchy. It turned human lives into manageable anomalies, ensuring that the system could continue functioning without confronting its own crimes. The obvious truth never disappeared. It lived in faces, in resemblances, in the discomfort of glances held too long. But the label gave society permission to look away. It provided an official story that required no follow-up, no investigation, and no accountability. And once written down, it became harder to challenge, harder to undo, harder to replace with the reality it was designed to hide. Alabama's slave laws were built to resolve contradictions before they could become threats. They anticipated situations that would challenge the logic of racial hierarchy, and answered them with rules that favored ownership over truth. One of the most important of these rules declared that a child's status followed the condition of the mother. It did not matter who the father was, what he looked like, or where he stood in society. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved. This single legal principle neutralized every visible contradiction that slavery produced. Appearance created problems that law was designed to silence. A child with pale skin, light eyes, or red hair disrupted the visual logic of slavery. These features suggested whiteness, and whiteness was supposed to signify freedom, authority, and legitimacy. Without legal intervention, such children might have forced questions that threatened the system's moral claims. The law stepped in to ensure that sight had no power. What people saw did not matter as much as what the law declared. By prioritizing maternal status over paternal identity, the law protected white men from consequence. Fathers did not need to be named, acknowledged, or held responsible. Their whiteness could not be inherited in any way that challenged property relations. Even when resemblance was unmistakable, the law refused to recognize it. Bloodlines were irrelevant unless they flowed downward into slavery, never upward into obligation. This legal framework was not accidental or neutral. It was refined over time to address exactly these situations. Legislators understood that slavery would inevitably produce mixed appearance children. Rather than preventing abuse, they chose to manage its outcomes. The law did not seek to stop exploitation. It sought to profit from it. Every child born to an enslaved woman increased the enslaved population, regardless of who the father was. Visible white ancestry tested this system constantly. A pale-skinned child forced communities to confront the gap between legal definition and lived reality. The law responded by insisting that definition alone mattered. Courts did not entertain arguments based on appearance. Freedom suits based on looks were rare and difficult, requiring extraordinary evidence and resources that enslaved people did not possess. The law's rigidity ensured that visual ambiguity never translated into legal uncertainty. Owners relied on this certainty. It allowed them to treat children who looked white exactly as they treated those who did not. It reassured buyers that no matter how a child appeared, ownership was secure. Bills of sale listed children without concern for complexion. Because the law guaranteed that no claim could arise from it, commerce continued uninterrupted. For enslaved people, this legal reality was devastating. It confirmed that no amount of evidence could alter their condition. A child could resemble her father completely, and still be denied recognition. The law erased lineage selectively, acknowledging only what preserved hierarchy. Fathers existed biologically but not legally. Mothers existed reproductively but not as witnesses. Children existed economically but not as heirs. The contradiction between law and appearance shaped daily interactions. Overseers enforced discipline without hesitation, even when punishing children who looked like members of their own class. Masters issued orders to daughters they would never publicly claim. The law provided cover for this behavior, framing it as normal rather than monstrous. Authority did not need to justify itself when legality was on its side. This framework also shaped how society talked about race. Whiteness became something that could be seen but not claimed. It existed as an aesthetic without rights. Blackness became a legal condition rather than a visual one. The law taught people to distrust their own eyes and defer to classification. In doing so, it trained generations to accept contradictions as ordinary. Challenges to this system were rare and dangerous. Enslaved people who attempted to claim freedom based on appearance faced enormous risk. Failure could result in harsher treatment, sale, or separation from family. Success required documentation that rarely existed, witnesses who could testify, and access to courts that were openly hostile. The law was not designed to be navigated by those it oppressed. The emphasis on maternal status also intensified the vulnerability of enslaved women. Their bodies became the legal gateway through which slavery reproduced itself. White men could exploit them without fear that resulting children would complicate inheritance or social standing. The law turned violation into profit, transforming personal violence into economic stability. Over time, this legal logic became normalized. Children grew up knowing that what they looked like did not matter. They learned that freedom was not something one could resemble into existence. This knowledge shaped identity in painful ways, forcing people to reconcile visible difference with legal sameness. The law demanded that they deny part of themselves to survive. The contradiction was never resolved. It was managed. Law and appearance coexisted in tension, each contradicting the other, but only one carried authority. The law spoke louder than faces, louder than memory, louder than resemblance. It defined reality in a way that ensured continuity of power, even as living evidence accumulated all around it. By insisting that status followed the mother and nothing else, Alabama's legal system closed every door that appearance might have opened. It rendered whiteness meaningless when it appeared in enslaved bodies, and meaningful only when it protected those who already held power. In this way, the law did not merely respond to contradiction. It absorbed it, neutralized it, and folded it back into the machinery of slavery, allowing the system to continue operating without ever acknowledging the truth written plainly on the faces of the children it created.
On Alabama plantations, one of the most disturbing realities was the way power folded back on itself, allowing men to claim ownership over labor who bore their own features. The system did not consider this a contradiction. It treated it as efficiency. A master could look at a child with his eyes, his hair color, the shape of his face, and still see property. The law gave him that permission, and the culture reinforced it through silence. These situations did not always unfold openly. Often there was no public acknowledgement at all. The resemblance existed, but it was never named. A girl might look unmistakably like the man who owned her, but no one spoke of it directly. Servants noticed. Enslaved workers noticed. Visitors sometimes noticed. The master noticed most of all, yet the absence of words made the reality easier to live with. If no one said it aloud, it could not demand response. Ownership provided emotional distance. By defining a child as property, a master could suppress any sense of responsibility that resemblance might provoke. The language of slavery allowed him to frame the relationship not as father and daughter but as owner and asset. This distinction was not natural. It had to be constantly reinforced through discipline, routine, and denial. Any softness risked exposing the truth beneath the role. Some masters expressed their discomfort through control rather than care. A child who looked too much like them might be watched more closely, corrected more harshly, or kept at a distance. Punishment became a way to reassert hierarchy. Violence reminded everyone, including the man himself, that resemblance did not equal kinship. Authority had to be visible, especially where biology blurred boundaries. Others chose a different strategy. They kept such children close, assigning them work inside the house, educating them slightly, or granting small privileges that could be explained away as practicality. These gestures were never framed as affection. They were conditional, revocable, and carefully limited. The child might benefit temporarily, but she remained enslaved, dependent on the man whose face she shared, and whose power she could never challenge. For the child, this dynamic was deeply confusing. She grew up under the authority of someone who looked familiar in ways she could not explain. She might catch her reflection and see echoes of the man who commanded her labor. She might sense a tension in the room when she entered, a hesitation that others did not provoke. These signals communicated truth without words, shaping her understanding of herself long before she had language for it. Enslaved mothers watched this unfold with a mix of fear and anger. They knew the resemblance was dangerous. It could invite jealousy from white women, cruelty from overseers, or increased scrutiny from the master himself. A child who looked like her owner was never safe. The mother could not claim the connection or deny it. She could only try to shield her child from attention, often unsuccessful. The system benefited from this arrangement. By allowing men to own their own children, slavery collapsed accountability entirely. There was no incentive to restrain behavior, because consequences were converted into assets. Each child represented increased labor, increased value, and increased control. The emotional cost was irrelevant to a system designed around profit and dominance. This reality also distorted white masculinity. Power replaced responsibility. Fatherhood, stripped of obligation, became meaningless. A man could reproduce without legacy, intimacy without acknowledgement. His public identity remained intact, untouched by the lives he created. Slavery allowed men to divide themselves, performing morality in public while practicing exploitation in private. For the wider white community, this arrangement was tolerated because it preserved order. Acknowledging these relationships openly would have forced difficult questions about consent, morality, and family. Silence was easy. As long as the children remained enslaved, the contradiction could be ignored. Ownership resolved what recognition would have complicated. The presence of these children haunted daily life on plantations. Every interaction carried subtext. A command spoken to a child who mirrored the speaker's face carried a weight that words alone could not convey. A punishment inflicted on such a child reinforced not just authority but denial. The act became a performance, proving to everyone watching that blood meant nothing in the face of power. Over time, this normalization reshaped how people understood family itself. Kinship lost meaning when it did not confer protection. Blood became irrelevant unless it served dominance. Children learned that resemblance did not equal belonging, and that proximity to whiteness offered no guarantee of safety. These lessons were absorbed early and carried quietly. This dynamic left no room for innocence. Even young children sensed the imbalance. They learned when to look away, when to speak, when to remain silent. They learned that the man who controlled their life might also be the reason they existed, and that this truth could never be spoken aloud. Knowledge became something internal, carefully guarded. The master's authority depended on this silence. If the relationship were acknowledged, it would demand explanation, justification, or change. By refusing acknowledgement, he preserved control. The system supported him by treating ownership as absolute and lineage as irrelevant. Together they created a world where a man could deny his own reflection and still be considered respectable. This reality did not remain contained to individual plantations. It spread across generations, leaving descendants with unanswered questions and fractured history. Records listed ownership but not origin. Faces carried clues that documents refused to explain. The truth survived in bodies rather than books, passed down through resemblance rather than recognition. It turned fathers into owners, children into property, and blood into something that could be ignored at will. It allowed men to command, punish, and profit from lives that carried their own features, while remaining publicly untouched by the consequences of their actions. On Alabama plantation, the fate of children born with unusual features, pale skin, red or light hair, eyes that seemed too light for their surroundings, was often determined by calculation rather than care. These children were visible contradictions to the system, reminders of power abused and boundaries crossed. Plantation owners, recognizing the potential danger that such children represented, developed strategies to manage them, strategies that relied on separation, concealment, and sale rather than protection or acknowledgement. The children became commodities not only in economic terms, but in social and political terms as well, tools to maintain control and avoid scandal. Some children were hidden inside the main house, or other indoor spaces. This was not done out of affection or concern for their well-being. It was a matter of risk management. Indoors, children could be supervised more easily. Their appearance could be obscured by clothing, by proximity to others, by controlled lighting. Outsiders visiting the plantation might see them at a distance, but would rarely notice anything unusual. Being kept inside allowed the plantation to preserve the illusion that racial and social boundaries remained intact, even when reality suggested otherwise. Other children were sold far away from the place of their birth. Sale served multiple purposes. It removed potential witnesses to resemblance, it silenced rumors, and it redistributed labor according to the needs of the owner. A child born under ambiguous circumstances might be sent to a distant plantation where nobody could connect her to her father. There she could grow up under different supervision, performing labor that reinforced her status as property rather than highlighting her unusual features. Sale became a tool of both economic exploitation and social control. A third approach involved keeping children close to the big house, while carefully managing their visibility. These children often performed indoor work, learning skills that were useful to the household rather than the fields. They might cook, clean, or assist with other domestic tasks. These assignments were never framed as privileges. They were strategic. The children were visible enough to be useful, but controlled enough to minimize scrutiny. Their presence reminded the household of the contradiction they embodied while limiting the disruption it could cause. Plantation strategies extended to everyday routines. Children might be dressed in ways that disguised unusual traits. Hairstyles could obscure red or light hair. Clothing could shield pale skin from the sun and the eyes of outsiders. Timing of work and chores could be adjusted to minimize exposure. Attention was constant and deliberate, ensuring that appearances aligned with the narrative the plantation wanted to project. Every decision, from labor to dress to location, was made with surveillance and control in mind. These management strategies were enforced through a combination of oversight and threat. Overseers were tasked with monitoring the children, noting their movements, and correcting any behavior that drew attention. Mothers were often instructed,
implicitly or explicitly, on how to manage their children's presence. Failure to comply could result in punishment, sale, or reassignment. The system reinforced itself by making the consequences of mismanagement immediate and personal. The psychological impact on children was profound. They learned early that their appearance marked them as different and dangerous. They absorbed the tension in the room, the looks that others could not explain, and the guarded speech of adults around them. This knowledge shaped identity, teaching children to conceal features, to lower their eyes, to move cautiously. Survival required constant awareness of both the physical and social landscape. Long before they understood why, enslaved mothers bore a particular burden. They had to navigate the plantation strategies while protecting their children as best they could. Hiding, relocating, or acquiescing to sale was not a choice but a necessity. Mothers learned to negotiate between survival and love, understanding that any resistance could endanger both themselves and their children. The system forced them to internalize its priorities, teaching lessons in caution, strategy, and silence that were passed from one generation to the next. The broader community of enslaved people observed and absorbed these strategies. They shared information about who was hidden, who had been sold, and who remained under close supervision. Knowledge circulated carefully, as always, in whispers and warning. Community memory preserved the facts of management, even as the official record erased them. Stories passed down through generations highlighted patterns, not individuals, emphasizing lessons of caution, vigilance, and adaptation. White society relied on these strategies to maintain the illusion of control. Children whose appearance suggested white ancestry threatened social hierarchies and moral claim. By concealing, selling, or controlling them, plantation owners protected not only their economic interests, but their social reputations. Outsiders visiting a plantation could leave confident that boundaries had been maintained, unaware that they had only been managed. The appearance of order masked the reality of exploitation and secrecy. Economic considerations were inseparable from social ones. Every child born represented labor that could be harnessed, whether in the fields, the house, or as a commodity for sale. Unusual features increased the perceived risk of scandal, so management strategies served a dual purpose: controlling appearance while maximizing profit. Plantation owners calculated the cost of visibility versus the gain from keeping children as property, often erring on the side of caution and control rather than confrontation or acknowledgement. These practices reinforced the hierarchy of slavery in subtle but powerful ways. Children learned their place not only through direct instruction but through observation of how the system managed them. Mothers understood that authority was absolute, and their knowledge of paternity was irrelevant. Overseers enforced policies that maintained power structures without questioning morality. The entire plantation ecosystem worked to integrate these contradictions into daily life, ensuring that survival depended on obedience, concealment, and adaptation. Over time, the management of children with unusual features became routine. Patterns emerged that were familiar to both enslaved communities and white owners. Certain behaviors, arrangements, and strategies were repeated across plantations. The system normalized the concealment and sale of children, treating what was morally abhorrent as administratively ordinary. History would later record the mechanisms, but rarely the human experiences behind them, leaving fragments of understanding to be pieced together from memory and documentation. On Alabama plantations, the absence of records, names, and acknowledged lineage created a persistent and haunting void. Children born with features that suggested white ancestry, pale skin, red or light hair, light eyes, were immediately placed into a system designed to deny them their origin. Official documents listed them without fathers, labeled them as mulatto or simply enslaved, and often omitted crucial details about birth dates, locations, or circumstances. The deliberate gaps in record-keeping were not accidental oversights, but strategic tools to enforce silence, deny accountability, and maintain social and economic control. The absence of a father's name had profound consequences. It erased legal responsibility, ensuring that no white man could be held accountable for his role in conception. In Alabama, the law dictated that status followed the mother, but society often demanded more than legality. It demanded perception. A child's resemblance to a white man could provoke discomfort or questions, but the lack of recorded paternity ensured that these questions could never translate into public claims or legal challenges. Silence on paper became a shield for power in practice. Mothers often had no voice in the process. Even when they knew who the father was, they could not assert it legally or socially. Enslaved women were denied testimony against white men in courts and excluded from official documentation that might name the father. Their knowledge existed only in the intimate confines of the quarters, passed in whispers to trusted peers, or held silently as a personal burden. The absence of acknowledgement on official records reinforced the enforced invisibility of their experiences, turning memory into the only repository of truth. Children grew up with gaps in their own history. They could see traits in themselves that reflected someone outside their immediate family, yet no record confirmed parentage. They inherited names given by the plantation, not by their families. They inherited labor assignments determined by law and utility, not by identity. These gaps created confusion, shaping their sense of self around absence rather than presence. What was unknown became central to understanding who they were. The lack of documentation also protected the broader plantation structure. White men could act with impunity because their actions left no trace. Even when resemblance was obvious, the absence of a recorded father meant that economic, legal, and social consequences were entirely deflected onto enslaved women and children. This structure reinforced hierarchy, ensuring that control remained concentrated in the hands of those already empowered. The system was resilient precisely because it relied on what it chose not to record. The invisibility extended into historical memory. Later generations attempting to trace lineage encountered only fragments, baptismal entries without fathers, bills of sale with minimal detail, scattered mentions in personal correspondence. The missing information created a distorted understanding of family, ancestry, and community. Historians and descendants alike faced a landscape of silence, where the absence of documentation was itself a form of erasure, reflecting deliberate choices rather than happenstance. This absence shaped daily life as well. Children and mothers learned to navigate the unspoken rules of acknowledgement and denial. A child might be disciplined differently because no documentation connected her to her father, or she might be hidden or sold before questions could arise. Mothers carried the burden of explanation privately, using caution and strategy to protect their children from scrutiny and punishment. The gaps in record-keeping required a continuous performance of obedience and concealment, teaching lessons that would echo across generations. The omission of fathers' names also intensified social tensions. Enslaved communities were aware of who the fathers might be, but speaking openly about it was dangerous. Rumors circulated in hushed tones, creating a network of knowledge that existed parallel to official silence. The tension between private awareness and public invisibility shaped relationships, community hierarchies, and survival strategies, reinforcing the necessity of discretion in all interactions. Plantation owners relied on these omissions to maintain control over labor and inheritance. Without named fathers, children could not claim property status or influence that might disrupt the plantation's hierarchy. The absence of lineage made them entirely dependent on the system that exploited them. It guaranteed that ownership remained absolute, and that family ties could not challenge authority. Every blank space in a ledger reinforced dominance and minimized potential resistance. Even within households, the gaps had symbolic weight. Children who resembled white men could not be acknowledged without disrupting social norms. Mothers could not speak, children could not question, and owners could manipulate visibility and labor to maintain the facade of normalcy. Absence on paper translated into absence in practice, reinforcing the idea that the system's definitions of property, race, and legitimacy mattered more than human relationships or lived realities. Over time, these omissions became institutionalized. Patterns of absent fathers, anonymous lineage, and incomplete records repeated across generations. The mechanism was self-perpetuating. Once established, it reinforced itself through law, custom, and daily practice. Children grew into adults aware of their gaps. Mothers carried forward knowledge that could not be declared, and the system continued unchallenged, dependent on the deliberate erasure of crucial information. The psychological and cultural effects were enduring. A life built around absence shapes identity differently than one grounded in acknowledgement. Children learn to negotiate existence within spaces defined by what was missing, internalizing lessons about authority, visibility, and survival. They grew to understand that lineage, resemblance, and knowledge could not alter their status or protect them from the demands of the plantation, teaching resilience under conditions of systemic erasure. The absence of names and lineage also reinforced the transactional nature of slavery. Children became assets defined by their labor potential rather than individuals defined by ancestry. Property classification substituted for recognition of family and heritage. The missing details ensured that any moral or social obligations could be ignored entirely, embedding exploitation into the very records meant to document life on the plantation. In this way, the deliberate gaps in record-keeping were both practical and symbolic. They served to maintain economic control, enforce social hierarchies, and erase the consequences of abuse. They ensured that visibility did not translate into accountability, that resemblance did not translate into recognition, and that knowledge held by mothers or communities could never challenge ownership. The absence of fathers' names was not a neutral void. It was an active tool of oppression shaping the lives, identities, and memories of children and mothers alike.
On Alabama plantations, children born with pale skin, red or light hair, and other features that suggested white ancestry were living evidence of a system built on denial. Every glance at them, every recognition of resemblance was a reminder that the rules of ownership and power existed alongside undeniable truths that the system refused to confront. The contradiction between what was visible and what was acknowledged created a tension that shaped daily life, labor, and relationships in ways both subtle and profound. These children became symbols without meaning, proof of acts no one would name, embodiments of realities no one would admit. They reminded enslaved people of the violations their mothers endured and reminded white communities of the compromises that underwrote their social order. Their very existence was uncomfortable, destabilizing, and therefore had to be managed with care. Yet management did not equate to protection, affection, or recognition. It meant surveillance, control, and calculated decisions about visibility, labor, and social positioning. The psychological weight of living as a visible contradiction was immense. Children were constantly aware of how they were perceived. They sensed the whispers, the sidelong glances, the subtle shifts in behavior from those around them. Their mothers taught them early to navigate these signals, when to speak, when to remain silent, how to move through spaces without drawing attention. These lessons were not optional. Survival depended on them. The ability to conceal traits that marked them as different became a skill, one that shaped identity long before words could articulate it. Plantation owners, for their part, treated these children as extensions of both control and denial. They were proof of power exercised without consequence, of authority maintained even when morality was compromised. In some cases, children were hidden indoors out of sight of visitors or other workers. Their visibility managed to prevent rumor and speculation. In other cases, children were sold to distant plantations, separating them from mothers, siblings, and communities, erasing local knowledge of their origins. Both approaches served the same purpose: to maintain a facade of order while exploiting labor and lineage for profit. The strategies employed by the plantation did not remove the underlying tension. They only contained it. Every time a child resembled a white man, the potential for recognition existed, yet that recognition was carefully neutralized. Language, labor assignments, placement within the household or fields, and even timing of work all became tools to manage perception. The system relied on a combination of silence, oversight, and movement to maintain a consistent narrative. The child was property, nothing more, nothing less. Mothers bore the emotional and practical burden of this management. They could not name fathers, claim lineage, or publicly acknowledge the child's resemblance to someone in power. Instead, they navigated complex social dynamics to protect their children. They taught them survival, taught them to respond to authority, taught them to negotiate visibility. Every action, how to dress, where to work, when to speak, was a calculated decision aimed at avoiding punishment and maintaining some semblance of safety. Enslaved communities observed and adapted to these realities. The presence of children with pale skin or red hair became a known phenomenon, circulating as whispered knowledge carefully shared to avoid danger. These stories carried warnings and lessons, teaching both mothers and children how to anticipate and respond to attention from both white and black observers. The lessons were subtle, embedded in routine and observation, shaping social behavior across generations. White society, meanwhile, relied on these practices to preserve its image. The existence of children with obvious resemblance to white men threatened the moral and social justification of slavery. Managing these children through concealment, sale, or controlled placement protected the public perception of racial and social boundaries. Outsiders could visit a plantation and see an orderly household, unaware of the contradictions managed just beyond. The appearance and perception became more important than truth, a hallmark of systemic control. Economic considerations intertwined with social management. Every child represented labor potential, and every visible contradiction represented risk to authority. Plantation owners had to balance profit with perception, ensuring that labor was optimized while the child's appearance did not invite questions. Decisions were made strategically, weighing visibility against utility, risk against gain. Children became units of calculation, their bodies subjected to management that treated resemblance as both liability and resource. Over time, these practices normalized what should have been intolerable. Repeated concealment, sale, and controlled placement made the system appear natural, even inevitable. Children internalized lessons about obedience, discretion, and self-regulation. Mothers internalized the impossibility of advocacy, knowing that the system was designed to absorb contradiction without consequence. Communities internalized the necessity of silence, sharing knowledge selectively and teaching the next generation how to navigate both visibility and invisibility. The consequences were lasting. Children who grew up under these conditions carried the weight of knowledge, observation and restraint into adulthood. Their understanding of family, authority, and identity was shaped by absence as much as presence. Resemblance could not translate into acknowledgement. Survival depended on recognizing and adapting to that fact. Every glance, every whisper, every act of concealment reinforced the system's lessons, that visibility did not equal power, and that truth could exist only in shadow. The plantation relied on these dynamics to perpetuate itself, by allowing children to live while controlling how they were seen, by denying fathers while exploiting resemblance, by combining legal definitions with social management. The system created a self-sustaining cycle of power and the contradictions were visible, yet unacknowledged, obvious yet untouchable, shaping the lives of those caught within them in profound and enduring ways. Children became markers of a system that thrived on secrecy and control. Their very bodies embodied the tension between what was real and what was sanctioned. Their survival required careful negotiation of attention, authority and appearance. Their mothers taught vigilance. Communities shared coded understanding and plantation owners enforced control through law, labor and social strategy. Every action and inaction reinforced the system, embedding the consequences of denial into daily life, memory and history. The story of these children, pale-skinned, red-haired, and born into a system that refused to name their fathers, reminds us that slavery was not only a system of labor, but a system of erasure. It controlled bodies, silenced voices, and rewrote truth to protect power. The lives of these girls were shaped by contradiction. Their appearance revealed realities that society refused to acknowledge, yet the law and custom denied them recognition, protection or identity. They existed in a space where biology, memory and observation clashed with authority, forcing mothers, children and communities to navigate survival in silence. Their resilience, however, cannot be overlooked. Despite the erasure, these children carried stories in their features, in their presence and in the quiet knowledge passed down by mothers and community members. They bore witness to injustices that records could not capture, lived the consequences of a system designed to dehumanize, and yet survive. Their existence stands as both a testament to the cruelty of slavery, and a reminder of the endurance, resourcefulness, and quiet defiance of those forced to endure it. In the end, their stories compel us to confront the full weight of history, not only the cruelty of those in power, but also the resilience and humanity of those whose lives were denied acknowledgement. Every glance, every whisper, every act of survival speaks across time, insisting that these truths be remembered, that the children who bore the visible mark of violation not be erased, and that history reckon with the full complexity of power, identity and survival under slavery.